Welcome back. You're watching live edition of World Insight coming to you from Beijing. How can proper governance make a difference amid global uncertainty? We try to find an answer through a series starting from today. We will bring you a special series called Governance Makes a Difference, a chance to hear out some of the world's preeminent experts and scholars. They offer sensible and deep insights on matters across border. To start things off, meet Professor Paul Romer of New York University, who's a Nobel laureate in economics. He said, although the pursuit of proper governance might be a constant battle, we can make it happen, particularly now. Let's listen in. Professor Romer, what a pleasure to see you in Beijing.
Well, it's great to be here.
You have been recognized by the fact that you are advocating sharing of technology. But the challenges are? Because you've been advocating about the sharing, obviously there's a deficit of it. So what are the major challenges for the deficit of it?
One of my big concerns right now is that we need good governments to make sure that the market works well. My initial work was the market can discover things, but that requires a government that does its job as well. And I think one of the big impediments right now is that many governments around the world are facing a challenge, that citizens are critical of government, they don't support government, they think we need to get rid of government, and I think this is a real threat to our ability to sustain progress.
Do you think those are the problems? I mean, the governments are the problems, or they are not necessarily the root cause of things?
Well, the governments sometimes don't do their job very well, but the mistake is to say, well, then we're just going to get rid of government. We don't want to have it. What we need to do is make sure governments actually do their job, which is to encourage research, for example, to support universities, but also to make sure that everybody in a society has a chance to get a job that can expose them to the benefits of new technology and help them learn and earn a good living.
One of the things people discuss recently, very frequently, is who are likely to be the most important players in terms of pushing the evolution of societies. From your perspective, Professor Romer, what do you think?
One fact that stands out when you look across a long period of time is that the leader in one era will typically slow down and another country will take over. So if you look ahead 100 years, 200 years, who the new leaders will be could be different than who the leaders are today. This is part of the inevitable change, just like some firms are successful for a while and then less so afterwards.
But the transitional period of time is extremely challenging and dangerous, as you may know.
I think dangerous is maybe a little bit too strong. I think the world is still a much better place than it was a century ago or 2 centuries ago. But we have to be vigilant because there are real challenges ahead.
What are the things that we should be vigilant about?
I think, for example, the kind of the global warfare that we saw in the 20th century, I don't think that's the biggest threat now. I think that's a much smaller threat. But things like the financial crisis that we had in 2007 and 8, that's a risk that I think we're now exposed to. And this was very harmful to economies. I think it also helped breed this anger in many countries, which is disturbing political systems. So I think a big challenge for the leading governments right now is to make sure we don't have a repeat of this financial crisis.
Inequality within societies are some of the important issues for many countries. However, some of the politicians tend to export the problem by pointing fingers to the others. I'm not talking about specific countries, just as a trend. And therefore, geopolitics becoming ever more intense. And this is feeding on one another, the two factors. So Professor Romer, as someone who won the Nobel Prize for a sharing of the best of the world, what do you make of this trend? Are politicians the problem or the solution?
I think government needs to do a better job. One of the best ways that governments have helped give everybody access to a good life is through investments in education. And I don't think, at least in my country and in the West, I don't think we've made the big new investments in better education in, say, the last 50 years that we made in the first half of the 20th century. So we've gotten complacent, and we need to redouble our efforts to give everybody the kind of education that will let them thrive.
What were the problems that the education are not shared, the resources of it? Is it because of commercialization? Is it because government trying to kick the responsibilities down the road? What is it?
Well, in the early 20th century in the United States, we made a commitment that everybody could go to high school and should go to high school. That was unusual at that time. Right now, we've got a system where for college, we don't commit that everybody should be able to go to college. And that's the kind of new commitment we need to make. And it could be a technical school, it could be the traditional university, but we need to keep extending these opportunities for education. The other thing that I think is very important is to remember that young people learn things on the job. And so we need to make sure that if young people aren't in school, they get access to jobs, and that they're expected to take jobs where they learn on the job. And they're not always the most attractive jobs, but these entry-level jobs are very important for people to acquire skills that they're used throughout their lifetime. So in many countries, these high rates of unemployment we see for young people, this is a red flag that something is wrong, and we need to make sure they get into productive activities.
Technologies were being tapped as a resource for sharing of the best of the world. Yeah. Of course, also to give equal opportunities at the very beginning of it, at least. But Professor Romer, it did not turn out to be that way.
Yeah.
Sometimes the technological gap is creating ever more problem in our society than less. So what do you make of your theory? I mean, back in 2018, but now?
Yep. Well, if you think of chemistry and petrochemicals, refining, has given us many benefits, but there were some things that were real harms. For example, in the 1970s, we learned that there was a chemical called the CFCs that was destroying the ozone layer. Now, at that time, governments acted. As soon as they found that, they said, we have to stop this, we're going to ban that chemical. We had international treaties, and we saved the ozone layer. Now, what's the analog of that today? Well, one, we don't have governments responding in the same way to global warming, and that should worry us. But also, we've seen some uses of technology that are harmful. We've seen firms that have figured out how to get people addicted to devices and to control what they do and to manipulate them. We should have a government which steps in and says, this is wrong. We're not going to let innovation be used to exploit people and used to just create wealth for a very few without creating benefits for everyone.
But if you look at some of the recent stories, Professor Romer, for example, Chile as a country has to suspend hosting APEC, which is never happened over the past almost 3 decades.
Right.
If you look at the governments that are trying to deal with chaos on the streets, on their home turf. If you look at governments that were struggling to come up with budget or to have anything done in the parliament. If you look at governments that try to, Brexit or others, I wonder where is your confidence, Professor Romer, for governments?
I think first we have to diagnose what's causing the problems we're seeing. And there could be a couple of forces that are driving this. One that you alluded to earlier is inequality. And I think we haven't done a good job of making sure that everybody benefits from technology and trade. So governments, we know that in some countries, the governments do a good job of preserving equality, and others they don't. So the ones who don't need to do a better job. Now, I think the other thing that has caused a lot of the anger, the populism, the disaffection with government is this financial crisis of 2007 and 8. And so I think we have to be very careful not to let that happen again.
I am not naive, Professor Romer. I know Nobel Prize recipient would not even have solution for everything.
Okay.
But may I remind you that we are in a geopolitically complicated world these days,
Yeah.
particularly between China and the United States, for example. The
Right.
apparent trade war between the two largest economies not necessarily have already big impact on the global economy, but certain uncertainty,
Yeah. Yep.
which lead to global economic problems. That is exactly feeding your worry, which is about the global financial crisis. Is technology, which is your subject, going to help in any way?
Well, I think we shouldn't think of technology as the miracle cure. That if we just have new innovations, new software, new hardware, new pharmaceuticals, those alone will not generate progress. To make progress, we have to have governments that can do their job. We have to agree what their job is, and then we have to hold the government accountable and make sure it does the job. And we've had a period here of the last several decades where economists have frankly not been helpful on this, because we've often said just get the government out of the way. And we need to focus again on the important things that government can and should do, and then make sure that government does that.
What are those important things?
Well, so access to education, a sense that everyone has a stake in the benefits from growth. I think also protecting the environment and protecting people from firms that can be very aggressive, even predatory in their approach to making
But this
profit.
is common sense, isn't it?
Yeah.
Professor, it was once believed that common sense, that's what the government should do. That's why they exist. But how come common sense now becomes a rare item?
Yeah, well, it's kind of like it's a constant battle. You never can get complacent. I think we got complacent in many countries, and we also, in both the left and the right, started accepting this idea that the market can do everything, and it's just not true.
But it's also important who is in the government.
Yes.
Who are the decision makers?
Yeah.
Are they equipped with the skills, or
Yeah.
are they pure politicians?
But again, that's a choice. If we pay government workers well, if we promote the most talented workers, we could have very skilled people in government. And the decisions we're asking the government to make are very complicated, increasingly technical, scientific engineering questions. So we need to be sure that we can attract very good people, both talented and of high integrity, into our governments around the world.
It is a fact, and probably an unpleasant fact, that more and more people these days do not want to believe in institutions.
Yeah.
So, Professor, do you think there's a quick fix? Because we better fix it quickly.
I don't think it's a quick fix. And I think it's the job of people who are in public life, like economists and academics. It's our job to get the message out. And I don't think we've been doing that job very well. Economists bear a special responsibility here because we were so forceful in defending the market. We were so enthusiastic about the market that we tipped the balance. So we as a discipline, as a profession, need to right that balance and put more emphasis on the role of the government.
What about the other things, since you talk about technology? There is a danger, some suggest, as a result of geopolitics, or the way to innovate. There could be decoupling of certain kinds of innovative and technological cooperation in the world. China and the US could be one of those examples,
Yep.
but there could be other examples as well. Professor, are you concerned about that?
Let me give you an example. Somebody might have said, the Europeans are starting to build their own airplane company. So they're going to decouple from trade in the US firms with Boeing and Douglas who make airplanes, and this is a bad thing. In fact, the world is better off that we have Airbus that's making airplanes and not just American firms that have collapsed into a single firm, Boeing. So you could have called that decoupling, but you could also call it resilience. We now have, and you could call it competition, which is what economists believe in. It's okay if there's competing standards, competing, ways to do things. And it's actually kind of risky to overinvest in just one solution. For example, in servers, these machines in the cloud that we always connect up with, almost all of those servers run on one particular type of operating system. It's this open source Linux system. If something goes wrong with that ecosystem, the whole server ecosystem is at risk. The same thing is true of the hardware chipsets. There's one instruction set that is used by Intel and then AMD to run all the chips that run all these servers. It might be better for the world as a whole if there were more competing suppliers of the hardware. We shouldn't let those national rivalries get in the way of parallel systems and competition between those different systems. One of the biggest concerns that economists have right now is that we're not seeing enough competition. We're seeing too many firms that are too powerful, and it's competition that pushes us to do better, that forces innovation, that's really the driver of progress.
Some people are already very skeptical about what can be achieved worldwide. I wonder from you, after a long sigh, which I just noticed, can we hope much?
We can. When I was a graduate student in the late 1970s, it was a period of deep pessimism, especially in the West. The world looked kind of bleak. We saw problems with pollution, we started to see inflation rising, and there was great pessimism at that time.
And Cold War too.
Yeah, right, the Cold War, the threat of nuclear war. And I started working on growth by looking at history and saying, over time, things have really gotten better. We live longer. We have more opportunities to pursue careers that we find fulfilling. Women who for centuries were treated with much less equality,
respect,
had more opportunities. So if you look over the long sweep of history, there's a direction of progress that has been taking place, and there's no reason to think, like people thought in the 70s, oh, we're finally reached the end. Progress is going to stop. It wasn't true then. I don't think it's true now. I think if we work hard, progress will still come. But it's not something that will just happen if we just sit around and act complacent. It will happen if we make it happen. In English, we say, you make progress. We just have to work harder and make it.
Professor Romer, what a pleasure.
Thank
you so much for sharing your time. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure, too.
Thank you, Professor.